Pushkin. Hello, everyone. This is the first of what are going to be a couple of episodes in this mini-season from my colleague, Ben Nadaf Hafrey. Ben is the guy, when you're hiking through the wilderness, who says, let's go this way. And there's no trail. And you think, oh, I'm going to get eaten by bears. And then, no, you find some lost civilization and large piles of glittering gold. Ben started telling me this story, and I stopped him halfway through. And I said, oh, Ben, this is a spandrel. And what's a spandrel? One of my all-time favorite concepts, invented by Stephen Jay Gould. The spandrel is the thing that doesn't have a function, but which hangs around like a random hitchhiker because it happens to be riding along with things that do have a function. Like your earlobes. I mean, what are they there for? Doesn't it seem like they were all just along for the ride with the part of our ear that actually does useful things? Or your chin. What's up with the chin? We look at a spandrel and we assume there has to be a reason for it, and there isn't. They're just spandrels. My name is Malcolm Gladwell. This is Revisionist History, my podcast about things overlooked and misunderstood. In this episode, my colleague Ben Nadaf Hafrey investigates a spandrel you don't even realize you've been living with, something that none of us would ever think to question. Because it's such a bedrock part of our world, we all just assume it has to be there. And it doesn't. I'm talking, of course, about sirens.
Walk me through.
Oh, no. You really do.
Walk me through what we're looking at here. I'm talking with my wife, Julia Conrad, who happens to share an apartment with me on quite a noisy street in Brooklyn.
This is a log that you created, although I am represented in it. I think it looks like we only did it for one day of how many times we heard the siren and where we heard it. Wow, what a day.
Julia and I live opposite this grocery store that's all local, small batch, whatnot. So instead of getting just one delivery a day, they get like 15. Sometimes from trucks bearing, I assume, one sprig of artisanal basil. Next door, there's a noisy playground, and crucially, a fire station. A really active fire station. What happens is, the grocery store trucks block traffic, which means the fire trucks can't get out. And so, sirens. All the time. This, for me, as a writer, podcaster, and light sleeper, is a problem. So I decided to do some research. I made a spreadsheet. We counted from 9 a.m. till 10 at night, and we heard a siren 24 times. 24 times! And this is reliable data. Julia is a data scientist. She works for the New York City government, and she has held my spreadsheet to the highest of standards.
First, I have to say, I never understand your way of doing Google Sheets because the color coding seems to just be aesthetic. It's not actually representing anything in the data.
I don't need this. I get enough of this in my job. I don't need it from you. I will confess that the spreadsheet, consisting of mauve, baby blue, puke green, a cherry yellow, and several pleasingly varied shades of red, isn't even complete because it does not count the times we heard the siren in the middle of the night, when there is no one on the road. Maybe you didn't realize this, but emergency vehicles will sometimes run their lights and sirens even if there's seemingly no one around. Sirens can run anywhere from 110 decibels to over 130. That is ear-damagingly loud. The classic fire siren sound, like what you hear in your head if you imagine a fire truck right now, is called the Federal Q2B, and it's a whopping 123 decibels at 100 feet away. There's an actual corporation that makes the siren, Federal Signal. Fans post videos about the siren online. Here's what it sounds like. Maybe turn your volume down.
As we say, it's not a fire truck unless it's got a Q siren.
According to a helpful chart from Yale University, 123 decibels is just 2 decibels lower than the point at which, quote, pain begins. This would all be fine, except I kind of need my ears for my job. And this is why I began the log. The log has fields for all relevant data: date, time, branch of emergency service, location in the house from which we have heard the siren.
Well, there's really just two possibilities. You're either in the front of the house or the back of the house. But actually, some of these entries are logged for front and back. So that's when you know it's a really big siren.
There's also a field for reporter, Ben/Julia, and another for notes. And then, what is the final column?
The final column is called dog ?
This is the only field that matters. You see, there's a dog in my neighborhood who howls almost every time the siren goes off. And he sounds like this. A dog who, by the standards of people on my block, is practically famous. Have you heard a dog who howls every time the sirens go off?
Yeah.
You have?
I have. I mean, they're pretty consistent with it. They're dedicated to their howling.
I feel like my wife has heard the dog.
But there's a guy, Kevin, that lives after that garage right there, and he does.
So he's talked about this dog to you?
Yeah.
What has he said?
Oh, he's ready to do something about it.
It starts really low and guttural.
I thought it was like a werewolf or something.
I decided to take a two-pronged approach to my siren problem. Plan A, I had to see if I could prove that the sirens in my neighborhood were dangerously, unnecessarily loud. And Plan B, I needed a sympathetic face for my cause. Nobody really cares about podcasters, but everybody cares about dogs. And I had to assume that that dog was howling along with the siren because he was, like me, in serious pain. So, find the dog, stop the siren. It'd be that simple. Except the dog was not immediately forthcoming. So I pushed ahead with Plan A, noise research, which led me straight to Dr. Arlene Bronzaft.
I'm going to take you into the noise room.
What's the noise room?
Okay, you'll see when you get there, sir.
Dr. Bronzaft is an 89-year-old environmental psychologist who has been called the noise queen of New York City. She's done major noise studies, worked for 5 mayors. She grew up in Brooklyn and lives in a lovely, tidy apartment on the Upper East Side. Someone was jackhammering the street outside the building, and yet you couldn't hear a thing. Double-glazed windows, of course. She took me to her noise room. Noise room sounds possibly like the opposite of what I need.
Let me tell you, it is a very quiet room. This is quiet.
Wow. How did you get it so quiet here?
Oh, did I help make it quiet? The answer is yes. I did have a role in making it quieter than it would have been. Can you see the cooling units?
Yep.
Are they all enclosed?
Yep.
Who do you think made that request?
Bronzaft started her work during the golden age of noise control, the 1970s, when the EPA began regulating noise. Her early work demonstrated that noise isn't just annoying, it can get in the way of kids learning in school. And she just kept going from there. When the city updated its noise code in 2007...
In fact, it was my suggestion that they update it that carried quite a bit of weight. However, the literature that they were depending upon was older. So today we have much more solid literature on the link between noise and health. That's critical. And that includes mental health as well in learning.
That all checked out for me. Of course the sirens are too loud, but it can take a while for the research to make its way into policy. Now we have research linking even small changes in overall noise to significantly increased risk of heart disease, to say nothing of stress, poor sleep and its associated ailments, and, crucially, the effect of noise on exasperated podcasters.
Now, you mentioned sirens. All right. That deals with safety. That deals with getting someone to the hospital on time. However, the sirens in Europe are less offensive, are less intrusive. European people aren't dying, are they? The point is, if Europe could have quieter ones, you could come up with a method of quieting the sirens and still be as effective. I have not seen a study that has shown that if you have a less offensive, intrusive siren, that more people will die. Have you?
No.
So here I am. I'm a data person. Show me the data.
I left that meeting full of hope. There's no doubt that sirens are dangerously loud. I just need to find the data to back this up and figure out a new solution, like Arlene said. I went straight to the library and started digging around. But the more I saw about how clear it is already that these sirens are crazy, the less I believed that that data was going to make any difference in the world. And then I found a different set of data. Not something about noise, but something that undermined the very foundation of the siren's existence. We'll be right back. Berrien County, Michigan, sits on the southeastern shore of Lake Michigan. It's not too far from Kalamazoo. Quaint lakefront towns, golf courses, quiet. Unless you work as a paramedic.
I have like 4 jobs because doesn't everyone. And like right now, I'm at the Berrien County Health Department.
Jonathan Beyer, former EMT, and now medical director for the Berrien County Health Department.
I am not speaking on behalf of the Berrien County Health Department.
Beyer was a Boy Scout, scrupulous. The reason he was speaking to me is because, in his capacity as the EMS medical director of the Berrien County Medical Control Authority, he is responsible for the ambulances of Berrien County. And that means he's thought a lot about the noises that those ambulances make. And he's arrived at a very controversial position.
There is no evidence that lights and sirens helps anybody. There's plenty of evidence that it hurts people.
No evidence that lights and sirens helps anybody? This, even to me, an inveterate complainer about sirens, was a huge surprise.
I started life as a paramedic before I got demoted to doctor. I was a paramedic for 11 years. And when I was a paramedic in the Philadelphia area, we responded lights and sirens to everything. Like, you called 911, we just left, there we go. When I got here to Michigan, they had 2 sets of priorities, priority 1 and priority 2.
A lot of EMS across the country has a similar kind of tiered intake system, a way to rank every incoming 911 call based not on its importance, but on its time sensitivity. In Berrien County, they would tag a call with priority 1 or 2, depending on what the issue was.
There are more calls for service than there are ambulances, so we have to find some way to prioritize that.
Except the system wasn't really working.
And a lot of these triggers for things were like, if you ever complained of shortness of breath in any way, shape, or form, it made it a priority 1. But the problem is shortness of breath, or do you feel like you're having trouble breathing, an incredibly subjective question. And so the medics were coming to me complaining, it's like, why are we getting priority 1 dental pain? Because the person's like, I have a tooth pain. Oh yeah, it's making it hard to breathe. We were about 50-50 for priority 1s, which were lights and sirens, and priority 2s, which were not lights and sirens, speed of traffic.
So you only have a certain number of ambulances, but if a full half of your calls are coming in as urgent, how do you fix the problem? How do you get all those ambulances where they need to be? Well, an easy way is to get more places faster, which theoretically you can do very easily if you're exempt from all typical traffic laws, precisely why we have sirens. But it's a little more complicated than that.
So when you drive your car, you're used to things like red lights, everyone's going to stop. Once something interferes with that, the chances of an accident increase.
Specifically, it increases your chance of an accident by over 50%, which is crazy. This is according to a peer-reviewed 2019 study published in the Annals of Emergency Medicine. The risk is even higher when transporting a patient than when initially responding, but either way, the chance of an accident is a lot higher when you're using lights and sirens than if you're not. Also, these are very often bad accidents. Ambulances are heavy, not a risk worth taking if you're just responding to a toothache.
I started going, why are we responding to dental pain priority 1? So myself and I have a residency program here, and I had a couple of my high-performing medics and another EMS physician and myself. We spent a couple of weeks going through hundreds of these determinant codes going, does that really need priority 1?
So there's the accidents risk, but also, and this is really surprising, using lights and sirens doesn't actually save that much time on your route to the patient. For decades now, studies have shown that lights and sirens seem to save on average between 42 seconds and 3 minutes and 48 seconds. It's about 1.5 minutes of savings if you're in a city, and a little over 3.5 minutes if you're in the country, on average.
Yes, it's about 45 seconds to 3 minutes. And
that's not a critical interval most of the time.
For most disease processes. Cardiac arrest is one that I would put in the time makes sense, because in cardiac arrest, for every minute that you go without CPR being done, there's about a 10% increase in mortality and decrease in survivable brain function. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah, that is huge. But heart attacks are actually one of the few exceptions, not the rule. And yet they are the exception on which the rule is largely based. So all of these factors led Bayer to do something big. He restructured the tiers.
I tell the medics, and this is how I presented it, is consider lights and sirens a medical therapy, right? For every medicine that you give, there is an indication and there's a contraindication, right? If I were going to say, I'm going to give you epinephrine, well, why would I give you epinephrine? And the benefits have to outweigh the risks. So I wanted to think of lights and sirens that way. It is a high-risk procedure. When are we going to do it? When the risks are outweighed by the benefits.
They ran through their data on all the calls that they had responded to priority 1, lights and sirens, and they reassessed whether those really needed to be lights and sirens.
So cardiac arrest, people choking, respiratory arrest, things where seconds could make a difference. Yep, that is worth the risk to try to get someone there quicker. But other things like, well, she fell and broke her hip. Okay, that's an emergency and that person needs to get to a hospital. I don't doubt that. Is the 3 minutes going to make a difference in that person's outcome? No.
So with all this data, Bayer and his team changed how the calls were coded.
I wiped out about 50% of the priority 1 calls in Berrien County.
Let that sink in. Ambulance, lights, and sirens in Berrien County were sounding half as often as they had before. Now, even I was wondering, could you really know that this switch wasn't putting anyone at risk? Well, eventually, they followed up on the people the ambulances had picked up in the field to see how the hospital coded the patients as they came in. So if you went to someone as a priority 2, not that urgent, and they showed up to the hospital as a priority 1, that would mean that you'd made a mistake. How much more often was that happening under the new coding system than the old?
It was the same number.
Wow. There was basically no difference. As in, he halved the number of lights and sirens responses in Berrien County. He reduced the risk of accidents as a result, and it cost the people of Berrien County nothing.
When I instituted the change, I didn't really have much of a problem. 911 didn't have a problem with this because it just was a difference in coding for them. It didn't affect them. The medics themselves really liked it because the medics were like, yep, most of these things we are going on are not priority.
Bayer's on board. The paramedics are on board. Smooth sailing. Except
what ended up happening, and I'm not exactly sure how this got out, it went through all the proper channels on my side, like medical control in the hospital and the county. So that was okay. But it started getting publicized, and I don't exactly know how, but it started showing up on the hospital Facebook page about Berrien County Medical Control is killing people with slow responses. And oh boy.
Unbeknownst to Bayer, word had gotten out to the people who call ambulances. Big problem.
And if you drive in Berrien County, you won't see as many lights and sirens as you're driving. Ambulances will be using them only for time-sensitive cases, like a heart attack.
The local news began doing man-on-the-street interviews.
Literally, they were out on the bluff overlooking Lake Michigan, just interviewing people walking by, going, what do you think about ambulances coming to your house slower? And of course, people explode over it.
What did they say?
It's like, I can't believe this. And, this is terrible. Of course I want an ambulance there fast. And the hospital started getting a lot of flack. Some of it was very nasty. So people started on Facebook attacking the hospital. Oh, this is Lakeland just killing patients again. Just very bad vitriol.
At the time, though, Byer was blissfully unaware any of this was happening. Other jobs were keeping him very busy. But then one morning, he got a call.
I had done a 6 p. to 2 a.m. shift. And at 8 a.m., I got a call from the administrative assistant to the CEO of the hospital. Hi there, Dr. Byer. It's 8 a.m. What are you doing at 8:30? I'm like, and I'm still waking up because I've had 4 hours of sleep. And she's like, Dr. Hamill, at that point, the CEO of the hospital, would like to speak to you.
Byer gets dressed and hurries to Dr. Hamill's office.
And I'm met by them and the hospital attorney and being shown this Facebook page. And they're like, what did you do? This is terrible.
Byer's stunned. And then he begins to lay out the case against Sirens in a very Dr. Byer way.
I tried to explain what I had done have you ever taken physics?
Byer explained his move maybe a little inefficiently by using the equation for velocity. Distance divided by time changed to solve for time, or t. It amounted to this. If you're trying to get time down and you can't reduce the distance between you and a patient by putting more ambulances on the street because it's expensive, the easiest way to get it done is to increase your velocity, which means running your lights and sirens. But the problem is we now know that running lights and sirens significantly increases the risk of an accident. So maybe you don't want to do that either. Then the thing to do is to take a second look at t. Does time really need to come down by the small increment that we now know lights and sirens is going to reduce it? Not for most things.
I showed him some of the studies. He's like, your science is sound. You go next time, do a press conference. So I had a press conference, which is what you saw online.
Byer confronted the outraged masses.
And once that went out, all complaints disappeared in 6 weeks. And I've heard not a thing since then. In fact, now we right now are the leader in Michigan for the lowest rates of lights and sirens use in the state of Michigan for EMS.
Things worked out for Byer in the end. But I'm interested in that initial freakout because it reveals a basic assumption people make, myself included. Everything is urgent, so we accept this social loophole where you can break all known traffic laws provided you possess a device that emits the loudest, shrillest sound imaginable. What kind of world is this? I'm not arguing that we shouldn't have sirens at all, but it seems to me that they're not only too loud and crazy sounding, but like we use them way more often than is necessary because we're unwilling to let go of them. But of course, Berrien County is just one place. Approximately 20,000 EMS calls a year. And paramedics are just one branch of the emergency service. I shouldn't get ahead of myself. I was left with two big questions to answer next. Where did we get the idea that sirens are so necessary? And exactly how unnecessary are they? A good place to look is the same place we fell in love with EMS once upon a time. We'll be right back.
If you would have asked 18-year-old Jeff when I first drove lights and sirens, I would have said that they are always life-saving, and we absolutely need to use it. But I'm not 18 anymore.
Jeff Jarvis, the Chief Medical Officer for the Metropolitan Area EMS Authority in Fort Worth, Texas, an emergency medical service that serves over 1 million people in Fort Worth and 14 surrounding cities. He's been a paramedic since the 1980s. He served around New York City and Austin.
So 18-year-old Jeff, who's made his decision to begin to be a paramedic. So let me ask you a question. In the 1970s, did you ever watch the television show Emergency?
Oh, of course.
And did that have an effect on your becoming a paramedic?
It did. I thought it was the coolest thing ever.
In 1972, NBC began airing a television show called Emergency. That's got an exclamation point at the end, by the way. The theme song is the music they'd play in my version of hell. The show is about Johnny and Roy, two young paramedics working out of Fire Station 51 in Los Angeles. Except they're not paramedics in the beginning.
That special training program, remember? We were talking about it a couple of days ago.
Yes, sir. The para something or other.
Paramedics.
The series begins in a world where there basically aren't any paramedics, which was our world 53 years ago. 53 years. In 1971, there were a slim 12 paramedic units in the entire country, and it was kind of a Wild West situation. Details varied from place to place, but in some areas, it was illegal to give someone medical care if you weren't a doctor or a nurse. So about 50% of ambulances were just hearses, driven out of funeral homes by morticians whose sole purpose was to get patients to doctors as quickly as possible. And if that failed, back to the funeral home you go. This is actually how it worked. Emergency was a show dreamed up in partnership with the father of modern EMS, a guy named James Page, who worked at one of the first firehouses with a paramedic unit in Los Angeles. And the show was literally meant to make the case for paramedics. Every Saturday night, nationwide, on NBC, 30 million viewers at a time, not a few of whom became paramedics.
People are dying at the scene. People who could stay alive if there was somebody on the spot who knew what to do. Look, if that bill passed the legislature today, do you know how many people we'd have ready for the job? 6 men for 6.5 million people.
I learned about emergency in a brilliant essay by UCLA emeritus law professor Paul Bergman, where he traces the profound influence the show had not just on paramedics, but on lawmakers too, by dramatizing just how urgent every single 911 call is.
We almost had him back. Damn it, we almost had him back.
If he could have been defibrillated the moment they pulled him off the wire.
This is from the first episode, right after a maintenance man gets electrocuted and eventually dies. The doctor and nurse, who, by the way, are of course romantically involved, are talking.
Somebody should have been there with a machine in their pocket.
Not somebody.
The paramedics again?
Call them paramedics, a rescue team, that doesn't matter. Cal, if somebody with the right equipment and trained to use it had gotten to this man in time, he'd be alive now.
I won't use this situation to justify sending amateurs out to practice medicine on the street.
Trained amateurs. Trained by you and doctors like you.
Amateurs, Dixie. I spent 12 years in school and residency, and I'm still learning my trade.
It's a doubleheader pilot, and both episodes are full of these situations that dramatize the resistance to paramedics, which was very real. But the show argues that we need paramedics. And why do we need them? Because there are so many accidents where if only someone had been there in time, we could have saved them.
Including myself, I thought it could possibly be a success.
Well, her arm may not function as well as it used to, but at least it'll be her own. Your getting it here as fast as you did made the difference.
We're handy to have around, Doc. You gotta give us a try.
Bergman, the law professor, talked to the legends of EMS, and he heard all these emergency references. Dug through California hearings on the Paramedic Act, and he found emergency references. Letters from senators, emergency references. In the early years of the show, 46 states legalized paramedicine. To be clear, this was a movement that was already in process, but emergency was a big part of establishing the cultural expectations for what those units would look like. And it looked like lights and sirens to every call, because every call was all about time.
But you can't ask someone not to die while you're trying to find out what's wrong with him. And they do die, gentlemen, on the way from where it happens to my hospital.
This is from the second part of the pilot episode, when the skeptical doctor has come around.
They die by the hundreds every year. Not from mortal wounds, but neglected wounds. Not from incompetence or indifference, but from time. From lack of time. I'm in favor of more doctors, more hospitals, and better equipment. And I'm also in favor of this bill until those other things come along. Because it will save lives. Maybe a dozen lives, maybe 1,000. Maybe just one.
He's looking directly into the camera. right at those 30 million viewers.
And who knows which one.
Time. And if you succeed at convincing people that every situation is urgent, they're going to come to expect lights and sirens every time they call 911.
And how many of the calls in emergency do they respond to with lights and sirens?
100%. Absolutely. So think about it this way. On emergency, every call was a life-threatening emergency. Now, I say that knowing the first call they went on was not, but in the first episode, the pilot. But the vast majority were life-threatening emergencies. So sure, people got that that notion and expectation that that's what would happen. There are a lot of paramedics who joined up for those life-threatening emergencies only to find out that 85% of the calls is holding somebody's hand.
Sirens are all over the show. You may recall that the literal theme song of Emergency features sirens. And I think a lot of this time siren obsession is due to the fact that early EMS departments were part of fire departments. And a fire is a very specific kind of emergency. If you don't contain it, it spreads. So every fire is an urgent situation. And according to FEMA, anecdotally, firefighters use their sirens way more often than the police. But these days, even the fire service, in most places, seems to be based on an outdated sense of its mission. As of 2023, less than 4% of all 911 calls firefighters responded to were for fires. Most were for EMS and rescue. So, then it looks like the argument about siren reform broadly applies to firefighters too. The U.S. Fire Administration actually cited a bunch of studies about reducing siren usage just last year. Sirens are dangerous. They save time, but not that much. And things are often less urgent than they appear.
Sometimes that 3 to 4 minutes is clinically valuable. Most of the time it's not.
Jeff Jarvis did a massive study on lights and sirens using something called the ESO dataset, a national collection of emergency calls with unbelievably granular data attached.
7.5 million records. 5.9 million of those were 911 responses. We analyzed every one of those and calculated the proportion that used lights and sirens, and 86% of them responded to the scene with lights and sirens.
Oh my God.
The fundamental question we ask is, of those responses where you use lights and sirens, how many of them did we do something potentially life-saving? And what we ended up finding is 6.9% of those 911 lights and sirens responses did we do something even vaguely potentially life-saving. And we were rather generous with our description of what potentially life-saving is.
So this is crucial. Paramedics are responding with lights and sirens to around 86% of calls, when only 7% of them are resulting in a vaguely, potentially life-saving intervention. So why were they urgent? That means that in the United States, we're using lights and sirens somewhere between 80% and 90% more often than we need to.
The question I have that I can imagine people who are skeptical might ask is, well, how much do you really know from the call? Can you tell?
Most folks are using some type of emergency medical dispatch where there are scripted questions, and they will give each type of call a number and a letter. And the letter is called the determinant, and it goes from your echo level calls, which are most likely to be life-threatening, down to omega level calls, which are not very likely at all to be life-threatening. And those criteria have been evaluated multiple times with multiple data sets. Again, they're not perfect, but they are pretty accurate. For example, there is a call nature called eye problem. 0.67% of those calls resulted in a potentially life-saving intervention.
And how many did people run hot to?
All of them. It's just dangerous. And it's dangerous, and it's not really doing what we think it is. So it seems like it is an intervention whose time has come and gone.
So I want to play for you again a very specific moment from the pilot episode of Emergency. from the speech that doctor gave to the legislature about why we need EMS.
I'm in favor of more doctors, more hospitals, and better equipment. And I'm also in favor of this bill until those other things come along.
But those other things have come along. More doctors, advances in the ways we take 911 calls, better and more emergency rooms, better and more emergency medicine, better and more paramedics. To use Bayer's formula, we have reduced distance. Paramedic units are all over the place now in a way they just weren't in the world of emergency. But it seems to me like in our minds and on TV, it's as if nothing has changed since the 1970s. Emergency was the most significant early example of an entire genre of TV show that dramatized the emergency services. Before there was Cops or Rescue 911, there was Emergency. And here's the trick. All of those TV shows are based on the narrative conventions that Emergency pioneered. A world in which the TV show had not yet done its work, and help was always too far away and always came with lights and sirens blaring because that's what firefighters did. And these shows are everywhere. Rescue Me, SkyMed, Live Rescue, Helicopter Heroes, Island Medics, Air Ambulance ER, a show that was literally called Sirens, which is what they'll play on TV in hell for me. They even make this stuff for kids. This is what Paw Patrol is. Start 'em young.
There is in emergency departments everywhere, I see there's this concept called alarm fatigue, where when everything is an alarm, nothing is an alarm, to paraphrase The Incredibles, the cartoon movie. So you just get immune to these sirens. They're not doing the job.
So Jarvis, like Bayer, reduced the use of lights and sirens. He cut them by about a third. Did their response time increase? Yes, by a median of 6 seconds. And in the vast majority of cases, by less.
So it's turning out it's not making that much of a difference, and we're being much safer.
And this, I realize this is purely in the realm of hypothesis, but it seems to me commonsensical that were lights and sirens reserved for truly emergency use, you would see a more potent reaction to them. And likely then it could plausibly decrease response times.
So I'll put my scientist hat on and say that's an interesting hypothesis that needs to be tested. I will put my realist and my pragmatic public health hat on and say absolutely giddy up. I absolutely think you'll see that.
I like that hat. That's a very stylish hat you're wearing.
So here it is. Lights and sirens are a tool that currently seem to be way overused, and that overuse has real consequences. Most of all, for our burnt-out, overstretched first responders who go to work to save lives and wind up responding to everything as if it's a crisis, wearing themselves out and losing their hearing in the process. In 2015, 1,500 firemen sued that company, Federal Signal, the one that makes the iconic fire siren, for causing mass loss of hearing. A lawyer opposing them said, and I quote, "What's their solution? If you don't have sirens, people would get mowed down in the streets. The siren works exactly the way it should." End quote. I could not disagree more. And you know who else disagrees? That's right. I found him.
Okay. I am approaching Davy's house, which is coincidentally directly behind my house.
I was just walking down my street one day when an ambulance rushed by and I saw this dopey yellow lab stiffen and howl. I'd know that howl anywhere. I rushed over and I was like, "Hey, I've got a question about your dog." And his owner was very obliging. His name's Joe. The dog's name, Davy. And a while later, I came by their house for an interview.
Hello. Hi, Davy. Hi.
I'm Jen.
I'm Ben.
Hi, Ben.
So nice to meet you.
Come on in. Put him
That
on
was
leash
that
so
was a
he
very
didn't totally
very satisfying sniff sound I got.
Jen and Joe live one street over from me and Julia. A beautiful brownstone, 2 kids, and a noisy dog. We sat down at their kitchen table.
I'm curious if you could tell me about when you realized that you had a sort of eccentric dog.
Well, I guess it was like the first time we heard him howling at sirens because he didn't seem particularly distressed by it. Like a lot of times his tail wags. And he does get quite a reaction from like the neighbors, like the neighborhood. Like everyone usually turns around and stops and like laughs and they're like, I've never heard that before.
It turns out Davy is starting a movement.
His dog walker always like posts, like sends us emails like describing their walk. So, sometimes Davy has gotten his co-partners in walking the other dogs to start to howl with him.
But he's always the first howler.
He's definitely always the first howler, but I think he has taught some of the other dogs like how to maybe start doing this. So
their owners must be thrilled.
Jen is a psychologist. Joe is a composer for film and television. So together, they're experts on mammalian behavior and sound. So I'm inclined to believe their analysis of Davy's views on the siren subject. He's not in distress, which means he's not going to be the poster child for my anti-siren campaign. But I hadn't given up yet.
Do you share this view of Davy's howl origins, or what's?
So there's another theory, which this is the one I think if I had to choose one that I would like to believe the most, it is that the sirens harken back to a lost dog who has been separated from the group, and they are howling to reconnect with the pack, like a call and answer from a lost dog. That's another one of the theories. And that Davy is saying, we're over here. Come on, lost buddy. This is where we are.
He is a very neighborly dog. He loves to hang.
Jen and Joe are very neighborly people. I'm glad to know them now. Even if their dog is a huge disappointment to my anti-siren crusade, seeing as he really loves sirens. But it makes sense. It goes back to that evolutionary theory Malcolm was talking about at the top of the episode. The idea of the spandrel, and the things in our bodies and our worlds that we think we're selected for, but actually are just there, and maybe not doing us a whole lot of good. Davy's howl isn't quite a spandrel, if we're being pedantic. It's more like a vestige. He thinks he's living with a pack of dogs in the wild, but he's not. He's a house dog who lives in Brooklyn. A block away from a busy grocery store, a playground, a frustrated podcaster, a New York City government employee, and a fire station. A celebrity ignorant of his own fame. And a howler who howls, just because that's what he's always done. Revisionist History is produced by me, Ben Nadif-Haffrey, Nina Bird-Lawrence, and Lucy Sullivan. Our editor is Karen Shakurji. Original scoring and theme by Luis Guerra. Additional scoring by Jake Gorski. Jacob Smith is our executive producer. Engineering by Marcelo de Oliveira. I relied on quite a few studies in researching this, and I put a link to the bibliography in the show notes should you want any references for starting your own local movement. Special thanks also to Douglas Kupas, whose work helped launch the field of siren reform studies, Mike Tageman, Helen K. Rosenthal, Stephen Solomon, and Paul Bergman. I'm Ben Nadif-Haffrey. The really alarming music you're hearing right now was composed by Davy's owner Joe Saba for the trailer of the Michael Bay film Ambulance.
Get ad-free episodes of Revisionist History by subscribing to Pushkin Plus. Sign up on the show page on Apple Podcasts or at pushkin.fm/plus. Pushkin Plus subscribers can access ad-free episodes, full audiobooks, exclusive binges, and bonus content for all Pushkin shows.